The courthouse buzzed with whispers and sideways glances as the woman in the crisp navy suit made her way through the security checkpoint. Her designer briefcase and perfectly pressed clothes seemed out of place in the municipal court, where most defendants showed up in whatever they could find. But there she was, head held high, ignoring the raised eyebrows and questioning looks from the courthouse regulars. The security guard barely glanced at her ID before waving her through with a dismissive hand, already forming assumptions about why she was there. Little did he know, those assumptions would come back to haunt him in just a few hours. It had all started 3 months earlier when she received the court summons. Someone had filed a complaint about suspicious activity at her home in the upscale neighborhood where she'd recently moved. Late-night visitors, expensive cars coming and going, packages being delivered at odd hours, all perfectly normal things for someone who ran their own business from home. But apparently, some neighbors had decided there must be something more sinister going on. The woman had tried reasoning with the neighborhood association. She'd attempted to explain her work schedule, her client meetings, her legitimate business operations. But certain people had already made up their minds about what kind of person she must be, and how she must have acquired her beautiful home. Their prejudices were as clear as day, though they tried to hide them behind concerns about property values and neighborhood character. So here she was, forced to defend herself against baseless accusations in court. As she sat in the waiting area, she couldn't help but notice how the court clerk spoke to her, that tone of voice people use when they've already decided you're guilty of something. The clerk barely looked at her paperwork before directing her to wait with the other defendants, despite her repeated attempts to explain that there seemed to be some confusion. The morning dragged on as she watched case after case being called. People shuffled in and out, most looking defeated before they even spoke to the judge. She noticed how differently the court staff treated various defendants, the subtle changes in tone, the varying degrees of respect offered. It was nothing new to her. She'd seen it all her life. But this time, she allowed herself a small smile, knowing what was coming. Finally, her case was called. She walked to the front of the courtroom with the same quiet confidence she'd shown all morning. The judge, an older man with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, barely looked up from his papers as he began to read out the complaints against her. "Your Honor," she interrupted softly but firmly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The judge looked up, irritation clear on his face. He wasn't used to being interrupted, especially not by defendants. "Ma'am, please wait your turn to speak." "With all due respect, Your Honor," she continued, reaching into her briefcase, "I am not here as a defendant." She pulled out a document and handed it to the bailiff. "I'm actually here because there's been an administrative error. You see, I'm Judge Angela Richardson's sister, and I'm here to deliver some important documents related to an ongoing federal case." The courtroom fell silent. The judge's face flushed as he examined the papers she'd provided. Indeed, she wasn't just any sister of a judge, she was the sister of one of the most respected federal judges in the state, and she herself was a highly successful corporate attorney who had chosen to start her own consulting firm. The whispers started again, but this time they were different. The same people who had been quick to judge her were now trying to hide their embarrassment. The court clerk who had dismissed her earlier was suddenly falling all over herself to be helpful. But the woman wasn't interested in their changed attitudes. She had seen this scenario play out too many times before, people's behavior shifting dramatically once they realized who she really was. Instead of gloating or demanding apologies, she simply stood there, calm and professional, as the judge stammered through his apologies and dismissed the baseless complaints against her. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing the prejudices that had brought her to this courtroom in the first place. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused and turned to address the court directly. The words she was about to speak would set in motion a series of events that would change not just her life, but the entire community's perspective on justice and prejudice. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone waited to hear what she would say next. The morning's events had already shattered their preconceptions, but they had no idea that this was just the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would eventually make headlines across the state and force many to confront their own hidden biases. The courtroom remained silent as she began to speak, her voice clear and measured. "Your Honor, while I appreciate the quick dismissal of these charges, I believe we have a larger issue to address." She pulled out another set of documents from her briefcase. "Over the past 6 months, I've been documenting similar complaints filed against minority homeowners in this district. The pattern is troubling." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd been preparing to wrap up the case quickly and move on, hoping to minimize the embarrassment of the situation. But it was clear now that wouldn't be happening. "These documents," she continued, "show that residents of color in upscale neighborhoods have been subjected to discriminatory complaints at a rate 8 times higher than other homeowners. Most of these cases were dismissed, but not before causing significant distress and financial burden to the accused." She could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom. The prosecutor, who had been shuffling papers and barely paying attention earlier, was now fully alert. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, waiting for what would come next. "I didn't come here today just to clear my name," she explained, her voice taking on a quiet intensity. "I came because someone needs to shine a light on this systematic harassment disguised as neighborhood concerns." She turned slightly, addressing not just the judge but the entire courtroom. "My sister might be a federal judge, but do you know what happened when she first moved into her neighborhood? The police were called because someone reported a suspicious person walking around her own garden." The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. "Ms. Richardson, while I understand your concerns, this isn't the appropriate forum for—" "With respect, Your Honor, this is exactly the appropriate forum," she interrupted, pulling out yet another document. "As of this morning, I've filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of 12 homeowners who have faced similar discriminatory treatment. I'm here not just as a victim of false accusations, but as their legal representative." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The neighborhood association members who had filed the complaint against her suddenly looked very uncomfortable. The court clerk who had dismissed her earlier was now frantically typing something into her computer. "These people," she gestured to a group of well-dressed individuals who had quietly entered the courtroom while she was speaking, "are just a few of my clients. Doctors, business owners, professors, all of whom have faced baseless accusations and harassment in their own neighborhoods." One by one, her clients stood. There was a distinguished-looking older gentleman in a bow tie, a retired neurosurgeon. Next to him, a woman in her 40s, the CEO of a successful tech startup. Behind them, a young couple, both university researchers. Each of them had their own story of being judged, questioned, and made to feel like outsiders in their own communities. "We're not asking for special treatment," she continued, her voice firm but compassionate. "We're asking for equal treatment. For the right to live in our homes without constant scrutiny and suspicion. For our children to play in their own yards without someone calling the police. For the simple dignity of being treated as neighbors rather than intruders." The judge was now listening intently, his earlier dismissiveness replaced with genuine concern. He'd seen thousands of cases come through his courtroom, but something about this moment felt different. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which she presented her case, or the undeniable evidence she'd gathered, or simply the powerful presence of her clients, successful professionals who had faced the same baseless accusations she had. "Your Honor," she said, her tone softening slightly, "I know this isn't a formal hearing for our class action suit. That will come later, in federal court. But I believe it's important for this court to understand the real impact of treating these discriminatory complaints as routine matters. Each time we process one of these cases without questioning its basis, we become complicit in a system that perpetuates prejudice under the guise of property values and community standards." She paused, letting her words sink in. The courtroom remained absolutely still. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had ceased. "I'm fortunate," she continued. "I have the resources and knowledge to fight back. Many others don't. They suffer in silence, their lives disrupted by baseless accusations, their sense of security shattered by constant surveillance and suspicion." The judge leaned forward, finally finding his voice. "Ms. Richardson, you've raised some very serious concerns. I would be interested in reviewing the full documentation you've gathered." He turned to the court clerk. "Please clear my afternoon schedule. I believe this matter deserves our immediate attention." As the judge spoke these words, one of her clients, the retired neurosurgeon, quietly wiped away a tear. For 30 years, he'd endured similar treatment in 3 different neighborhoods, never expecting anyone to take a stand. Now, finally, someone was not only listening but preparing to act. The neighborhood association members who had filed the complaint against her were now huddled with their attorney, their faces showing a mix of concern and disbelief. They had clearly not expected their routine complaint to spark such a significant response. As the judge called for a brief recess to review the documentation, she remained standing at the podium, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She knew this was just the beginning of a long battle, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of hope. Not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel like an outsider in their own community. The next phase of this fight would require even more courage and determination. But looking at the faces of her clients, seeing their strength and dignity in the face of injustice, she knew they were ready. Together, they would transform this moment of personal vindication into a movement for lasting change. During the recess, the courthouse hallway became an unexpected forum for change. As her clients gathered around her, more people began approaching with their own stories. A court officer, who had maintained his professional distance all morning, quietly shared how his own mother had faced similar discrimination when she bought a house in an upscale neighborhood 20 years ago. A young law clerk, holding back tears, described her parents' ongoing struggles with neighborhood harassment. The woman listened to each story with genuine attention, her legal pad filling with notes, names, and dates. This was more than she had expected. The floodgates had opened, revealing a deeper, more pervasive problem than even her research had uncovered. Back in the courtroom, the judge had finished reviewing her initial documentation. His demeanor had changed noticeably. Gone was the dismissive attitude from earlier, in its place was a grave understanding of the situation's magnitude. "Ms. Richardson," he began, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't before, "I've reviewed your preliminary evidence, and I must say, it's deeply concerning." He removed his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully before continuing. "But I have some questions about the broader implications of what you're presenting." She stood ready, her posture relaxed but professional. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, not just today, but throughout her entire career. "Your Honor, I welcome any questions you may have," she responded, pulling out additional files from her seemingly bottomless briefcase. "In fact, I've prepared some additional context that might address your concerns." What followed was an extraordinary hour of dialogue between the judge, the woman, and eventually, other officers of the court who found themselves drawn into the discussion. She presented case after case, showing how seemingly routine neighborhood complaints often masked deeper prejudices. One case involved a renowned pediatric surgeon who had been reported for suspicious behavior when he went jogging in his own neighborhood. Another detailed how a university dean had security called on her while hosting a family barbecue in her backyard. Each story was meticulously documented, complete with police reports, witness statements, and neighborhood association minutes. "The pattern becomes clear," she explained, displaying a series of charts she'd prepared. "These complaints spike dramatically within the first 3 months of a minority family moving into certain neighborhoods. They're often couched in language about maintaining community standards or protecting property values, but the timing and targeting tell a different story." The judge leaned forward, studying the data. And you're saying this is happening across multiple jurisdictions? Yes, Your Honor. We've documented similar patterns in 12 different neighborhoods across 3 counties. But what's particularly troubling is the response from local authorities. She pulled out another set of documents. In almost every case, the authorities felt compelled to investigate, even when the complaints were clearly baseless. This creates a paper trail that can affect property values, insurance rates, and even future employment opportunities for the targeted homeowners. One of her clients, the tech CEO, stepped forward when called upon. She described how her company had nearly lost a major contract because a background check revealed multiple police visits to her home, all stemming from neighbors' complaints about suspicious business meetings that were actually just regular client consultations. The retired neurosurgeon shared how his grandchildren no longer wanted to visit his home after police were called while they were playing in his front yard. "They're just kids," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But now they're afraid to come to Grandpa's house because they think the police will come again." As these stories unfolded, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed. The court reporter wiped away tears while continuing to type. The bailiff, who had started the day maintaining a stern professional distance, now stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head in disbelief at each new revelation. Even the neighborhood association members who had filed the original complaint sat in stunned silence. Their attorney had given up trying to interject objections, perhaps realizing that this had evolved far beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice steady and clear, "what we're seeing here is more than just individual cases of prejudice. It's a systemic issue that uses legal and administrative processes as tools of discrimination. These complaints aren't just inconvenient, they're weaponized procedures that create real, lasting damage to families and communities." The judge nodded slowly, taking in everything he'd heard. "Ms. Richardson, what you've presented here today goes far beyond the scope of your original case. I believe this warrants immediate attention at a higher level." He turned to his clerk. "Please contact the district attorney's office. We'll need to establish a task force to investigate these patterns." But she wasn't finished. From her briefcase, she produced one final document, a proposal that would shake the very foundation of how neighborhood disputes were handled in the district. As she began to outline its contents, everyone in the courtroom realized they were witnessing not just the resolution of one woman's case, but the beginning of a movement that would transform their community. The afternoon sun slanted through the high courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the room. But for many present, it felt like the first light of dawn, illuminating a path forward that none had imagined possible when the day began. The woman stood steady at the podium, knowing that what happened next would determine whether this moment of revelation would become a lasting change or just another footnote in the long history of attempted reforms. The proposal she presented wasn't just a legal document, it was a blueprint for transformation. As she began explaining its contents, her voice carried the weight of years of accumulated experience, not just her own but of countless others who had faced similar struggles. "This proposal," she began, "outlines a 3-part system for reviewing and handling neighborhood complaints." She spread the documents across the judge's bench, pointing to key sections. First, it establishes an independent review board to screen complaints for discriminatory patterns before they enter the legal system. Second, it creates a mandatory mediation program that brings neighbors together to resolve disputes before they escalate to court action. And third, it implements a community education initiative to address the underlying biases that lead to these situations. The district attorney's representative, who had arrived during her presentation, leaned forward with interest. "These are ambitious proposals, Ms. Richardson. The implementation would require significant resources and cooperation from multiple agencies." She nodded, having anticipated this concern. "Which is why I've already secured commitments from several community organizations and private sector partners." She produced letters of support from civil rights organizations, local businesses, and even several neighborhood associations that had recognized the need for change. But then something unexpected happened. From the back of the courtroom, a voice spoke up. "I'd like to add my support as well." All heads turned to see an elderly white woman making her way forward. She was elegantly dressed, and there was something familiar about her bearing. "Your Honor, my name is Eleanor Blackwood," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "I've been the president of the Pine Grove Neighborhood Association for the past 30 years. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Pine Grove was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. The woman at the podium held her breath. Pine Grove had been ground zero for many of the discriminatory complaints she'd documented. But Mrs. Blackwood wasn't finished speaking. "I've watched our communities change over the decades," the elderly woman continued. "And I've seen how fear and prejudice have poisoned what should be welcoming neighborhoods. I've been complicit in this system, and it's time for that to change." She walked forward, pulling out her own documentation. "These are records from our association meetings going back 20 years. They show a clear pattern of selective enforcement and targeted complaints. I've kept these records, hoping someone would finally have the courage to address this issue. Ms. Richardson isn't just fighting for herself, she's fighting for the soul of our community." The judge looked from Mrs. Blackwood to the woman at the podium, then back to the proposal before him. "This is unprecedented," he said finally. "But perhaps that's exactly what we need." As the afternoon progressed, more community leaders came forward. A retired police captain spoke about the strain these baseless complaints put on law enforcement resources. A real estate agent described how subtle discrimination had shaped neighborhood demographics for decades. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle, creating a complete picture of how systemic bias had been maintained through seemingly neutral procedures. The woman stood steady through it all, her legal pad now full of new names, new stories, new allies in the fight for change. But she knew the hardest part was still to come. Implementation would require more than just goodwill and good intentions. "Your Honor," she said, returning to the podium after the last testimony, "I'd like to address the practical aspects of implementing these changes." She pulled out a detailed timeline and budget. "We've broken this down into manageable phases, with clear benchmarks and accountability measures at each stage." The judge studied the documents carefully. "This goes far beyond the scope of your original case," he observed. "You've essentially created a roadmap for systemic change." "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "Because addressing individual cases without tackling the underlying system would be like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. It might look like we're doing something, but the fundamental problem would remain unhealed." As she spoke, her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. She knew without looking that it would be her sister, the federal judge, checking on how things were proceeding. But this wasn't about family connections or professional standing anymore. It was about something much bigger. The courthouse lights had been turned on as the natural light faded outside. Nobody had left the courtroom, despite the late hour. There was a sense that they were witnessing something historic, a moment when the slow arc of justice was being bent toward true equality. The woman looked around the courtroom, at the faces of her clients, at Mrs. Blackwood, at the court staff who had started the day dismissing her but were now hanging on her every word. She saw hope in their eyes, but also fear, fear of change, fear of the unknown, fear of disturbing a system that, while deeply flawed, was at least familiar. She took a deep breath, preparing to address these fears directly. The next few minutes would be crucial. She needed to show them that change, while challenging, was not something to fear but something to embrace. As she began to speak again, she knew her words would need to bridge the gap between the world as it was and the world as it could be. The woman's voice filled the courtroom with quiet determination as she addressed the unspoken fears hanging in the air. "Change doesn't mean chaos," she began. "It doesn't mean tearing apart our communities. It means building stronger ones, communities where every resident feels secure, valued, and at home." She walked slowly from behind the podium, making eye contact with different people in the room. I understand the fear. Change is uncomfortable. But what's more uncomfortable is raising children in a community where they're seen as threats instead of neighbors. Just then, the courtroom doors opened, and a distinguished-looking woman in judicial robes entered quietly, taking a seat in the back. A few people recognized her as Judge Angela Richardson, but she made no announcement of her presence, simply nodding at her sister to continue. Today, something remarkable has happened, the woman continued. We've had honest conversations about issues that usually stay buried under polite smiles and formal complaints. Mrs. Blackwood's courage in sharing those neighborhood association records shows us that change is possible when people choose truth over comfort. She pulled out a stack of photographs from her briefcase. These are pictures from my neighborhood, not from the peaceful, affluent area where I live now, but from the community where I grew up. She began passing them around. They showed children playing together, neighborhood barbecues, community gatherings, scenes of genuine connection across racial and social lines. This was the Howard Heights neighborhood in 1985, she explained. Before gentrification, before property values became more important than people, this community found a way to thrive through connection rather than division. I keep these photos to remind myself that what we're proposing isn't radical, it's a return to the basic human dignity that makes neighborhoods true communities. The judge leaned forward, studying one of the photos that had made its way to his bench. I remember Howard Heights, he said softly. It was one of the few truly integrated neighborhoods in the city back then. Yes, Your Honor. And it worked because people chose to see each other as neighbors first. The systems we're proposing today, the review board, the mediation program, the community initiatives, they're not about special treatment. They're about creating structures that help people make that same choice. She returned to the podium and pulled out another document. This morning, I came here expecting to defend myself against baseless accusations. Instead, we've uncovered an opportunity for real change. But change requires more than just good intentions. It requires commitment, resources, and most importantly, accountability. The document she held was a pledge, already signed by several community leaders, including Mrs. Blackwood. It committed signatories to specific actions, participating in the mediation program, supporting the review board, and engaging in community dialogue sessions. We already have 15 neighborhood associations ready to implement these changes, she announced. We have funding commitments from local businesses who understand that diverse, welcoming communities are good for everyone. We have support from law enforcement who want to focus on real public safety issues rather than responding to biased complaints. From the back of the courtroom, her sister, Judge Richardson, finally spoke up. If I may, Your Honor. The presiding judge nodded, and she stood. The federal court would be willing to provide oversight and support for this initiative as a pilot program. What's happening in this courtroom today could become a model for communities across the country. The woman felt her throat tighten with emotion, but her voice remained steady. This morning, people saw me walk into this courtroom and made assumptions about who I was and why I was here. By the end of today, those same people have become partners in creating change. That's the power of choosing connection over division, understanding over assumption. She turned to face the neighborhood association members who had filed the original complaint against her. I don't want an apology, she said gently. I want your partnership. Will you join us in making our community stronger? There was a long moment of silence. Then one of the association members stood up, tears in her eyes. I've lived in that neighborhood for 40 years, she said. I thought I was protecting it. But today I realized I've been part of the problem. Yes, I want to be part of the solution. As these words echoed through the courtroom, more people began to stand, court staff, other association members, community residents who had been drawn in by the proceedings. It was a powerful visual representation of what could happen when people chose to stand together for change. The woman looked around the room, taking in the scene. She caught her sister's eye, seeing the pride and emotion there. But this wasn't about personal vindication anymore. It had become something much larger, a moment of transformation that would ripple out far beyond this courtroom. The judge cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the bench. Ms. Richardson, I believe we're ready to discuss the specific implementation of your proposals. But before we do, I want to acknowledge something. Today, this court has been reminded of its highest purpose, not just to interpret laws, but to ensure justice serves the cause of human dignity. As the afternoon light continued to fade outside, the real work was just beginning. The woman opened her laptop, ready to outline the next steps. She knew there would be challenges ahead, resistance to overcome, and difficult conversations to navigate. But looking around the courtroom at the faces of her new allies, from Mrs. Blackwood to the court staff to the very people who had initially complained about her, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel when she walked into court that morning: hope. The next few hours transformed the courtroom into an impromptu command center for change. The woman's laptop was open, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she documented the flood of commitments and ideas coming from all directions. The judge had ordered dinner for everyone, and the formal atmosphere had given way to focused determination. "We need to start with training," the police captain said, spreading out a map of the district. "Our officers need to understand how to identify and respond to potentially discriminatory complaints. We can't just keep automatically responding to every call without proper screening." Mrs. Blackwood nodded, adding her own insights. "And we need to revise our neighborhood association bylaws. I've seen how seemingly neutral language can be used as a weapon. We need to be explicit about what constitutes legitimate concerns versus discriminatory complaints." The woman looked up from her laptop, watching the scene unfold before her. People who had been strangers hours ago were now working together, their differences set aside in pursuit of a common goal. But she knew from experience that initial enthusiasm could fade when faced with real challenges. "Let's talk about the hard parts," she said, standing to address the group. "There will be resistance. Some people will say we're overreacting. Others will claim we're creating special privileges rather than equal rights. We need to be prepared for that pushback." Her sister, Judge Richardson, stepped forward. "That's where the data comes in. Everything needs to be documented, measured, and tracked. We need to show not just the human impact, but also the economic and social benefits of these changes." The woman pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop, projecting it onto the courtroom wall. "I've been tracking the hidden costs of discriminatory practices," she explained. "Legal fees, police resources, property value impacts, business opportunities lost. It adds up to millions annually in this district alone." The numbers caught everyone's attention. The business community representatives in the room started taking notes, seeing the economic advantage of supporting these changes. Even the most hesitant participants began to see how discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was expensive. A young police officer who had been quietly observing spoke up. "In my first year on the force, I responded to over 100 calls about suspicious activity that turned out to be residents simply living their lives. That's time we could have spent addressing real public safety issues." The woman nodded, adding his observation to her growing database. Each piece of testimony, each personal story, each data point was building a compelling case for change. But she knew they needed more than just evidence, they needed a strategy for sustainable transformation. "We need to think about sustainability," she said, pulling up another document. "This can't be just a one-time initiative that fades away when media attention moves on. We need to build these changes into the very structure of our community." She outlined a 3-year implementation plan, breaking down the larger goals into manageable steps. Phase 1 would focus on immediate changes, revised complaint procedures, officer training, and community education. Phase 2 would establish the independent review board and mediation program. Phase 3 would expand the program to neighboring districts. As she spoke, her phone buzzed with messages from other communities already hearing about what was happening. News travels fast in legal circles, and what had started as a simple court appearance was becoming a movement. "We're also getting offers of support from unexpected places," she announced, checking her messages. 3 major corporations in the area want to fund the community education program. They see this as an opportunity to demonstrate real commitment to diversity and inclusion, not just token gestures. The judge, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, spoke up. "Ms. Richardson, what you've accomplished here today goes far beyond resolving a single case. You've created a framework for systemic change that could be replicated across the country." She smiled, thinking about how differently the day had begun. "Your Honor, what we've accomplished today is just the beginning. The real test will come in the days and weeks ahead, when the excitement fades and the hard work begins." Just then, one of the courthouse custodians who had been listening while cleaning the room approached the group. "I've worked here for 30 years, he said quietly. "I've seen so many cases come and go, so many promises of change. But this feels different. This feels real." The woman reached out and squeezed his hand, thanking him for sharing. His words captured what everyone was feeling, a sense that they were part of something authentic and transformative. As the evening deepened, the group began finalizing their immediate action steps. Committees were formed, responsibilities assigned, and timelines established. The woman watched as former adversaries exchanged contact information, planning to work together on various aspects of the initiative. Mrs. Blackwood approached her as the meeting was winding down. "I've lived a long life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some bad. But I've never seen anything quite like this, people coming together to address problems we've ignored for far too long." The woman looked around the room one more time, taking in the scene. Court staff were helping to organize documents, police officers were engaged in earnest conversation with community activists, and neighborhood association members were making plans for their first mediation training session. This wasn't just about proving her innocence anymore. It wasn't even about fighting discrimination. It had become something larger, a blueprint for how communities could face their challenges honestly and work together for real solutions. 6 months had passed since that transformative day in the courtroom. The woman stood at her kitchen window, sipping her morning coffee and watching her neighbors walk their dogs, jog, and chat with each other on the sidewalk. The scene was ordinary, yet profoundly different from the suspicious glances and whispered concerns that had once dominated the neighborhood. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was time for the quarterly review meeting at the courthouse. As she gathered her materials, she reflected on how much had changed. The Independent Review Board had processed over 200 complaints in the past 6 months, identifying and addressing discriminatory patterns before they could escalate into legal issues. Arriving at the courthouse, she noticed how different it felt from that first day. The security guard who had once dismissed her now greeted her warmly by name. The court clerk who had been so dismissive was now one of their most passionate advocates for change. Inside the main courtroom, familiar faces were gathering. Mrs. Blackwood was there, along with representatives from 12 neighborhood associations, police officers, community leaders, and many of the original participants from that first day. The energy was different now, focused, purposeful, and grounded in 6 months of real progress. "Let's begin with the numbers," she said, standing at the podium where her journey had started. "In the past 6 months, discriminatory complaints have decreased by 78%. Police responses to suspicious activity calls have been reduced by 65%. But most importantly, our community satisfaction surveys show increased feelings of safety and belonging across all demographic groups." The retired neurosurgeon, who had been one of her first clients, raised his hand. "My grandchildren came to visit last weekend," he shared, his voice warm with joy. "They played in the front yard for hours. No police calls, no concerned neighbors, just children being children. That's what real change looks like." The police captain stepped forward with his own report. Our officers report spending more time on genuine public safety issues. The new screening protocols for complaints have actually improved our relationship with the community. People trust us more because they know we're not being used as instruments of discrimination. But it wasn't all positive news. The woman believed in honest assessment, and there had been challenges. We've faced resistance, she acknowledged. 3 neighborhood associations initially refused to participate. But something interesting happened. Their residents started moving to communities that had adopted our programs. Property values in participating neighborhoods have actually increased, while non-participating areas have seen a decline. Mrs. Blackwood nodded in agreement. Real estate agents tell me that diversity is becoming a selling point. Young families specifically ask about neighborhoods that have adopted our community integration programs. The judge, who had presided over that first day, looked over his reading glasses at the assembled group. When Ms. Richardson walked into my courtroom 6 months ago, I thought we were dealing with a simple neighborhood dispute. Instead, we became part of a movement that's attracting national attention. Indeed, representatives from cities across the country had been visiting, studying their model for community transformation. The woman's phone regularly rang with calls from lawyers, community organizers, and local officials asking for guidance on implementing similar programs. But the numbers and recognition aren't what matter most, she continued, pulling out those old photographs of Howard Heights. What matters is that we're building the kind of community these pictures show, one where differences are celebrated, not suspected. She walked to the window, gesturing at the street below. Last weekend, I hosted a dinner party. Cars were parked all along the street, people came and went late into the evening, and packages were delivered throughout the day. Not a single complaint was filed. That might seem small, but it represents a fundamental shift in how we view our neighbors. The young police officer who had spoken about unnecessary calls 6 months ago shared his own observation. Last month, we had a call about suspicious activity in one of our participating neighborhoods. But before we could respond, the review board had already facilitated a conversation between the caller and the supposed suspicious person. Turns out they now have weekly coffee together. Laughter rippled through the room, but it was the kind that comes from recognizing a deeper truth, that fear of the unknown often dissolves when people actually connect with each other. We're not finished, the woman reminded everyone. This is just the beginning. Phase 2 of our plan starts next month, with the expansion of our mediation program and the launch of our Youth Ambassador initiative. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing a group of high school students from diverse backgrounds who had signed up to be community liaisons. These young people will help us build bridges between different parts of our community. They understand that the future belongs to those who can create connection across differences. The meeting continued with updates from various committees, but there was a moment when the woman stepped back, letting others lead the discussion. She watched as former adversaries worked together, planning events and solving problems. This was perhaps the most significant change. People who had once viewed each other with suspicion now collaborated as partners in building a better community. As the meeting drew to a close, her sister, Judge Richardson, made a surprise appearance. "I've been watching what you've accomplished here," she said, addressing the group. "You've created something remarkable, not just a program or an initiative, but a new way of being community. The federal court system is now looking at implementing elements of your model across the district." The woman felt tears welling up in her eyes, but these were different from the frustrated tears she'd held back that first day in court. These were tears of recognition that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the most powerful transformations. 6 months ago, I walked into this courtroom feeling alone, she concluded, her voice strong and clear. Today, I stand here surrounded by partners in change. We've shown that when people choose understanding over fear, connection over division, and action over apathy, real transformation is possible. As people began gathering their things to leave, the courthouse custodian who had spoken on that first day approached her. "You know what the real change is," he said softly. "It's not in the numbers or the programs. It's in how people look at each other now, really look at each other, like they're seeing their neighbors for the first time." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Outside the courthouse windows, the city continued its daily rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't perfect, change never is, but it was real, lasting, and growing stronger every day.